What's up guys, my name is Greg Lester and this is Game Audio Analysis. And in today's episode we're going to find out why audio plays a key role in the stealth game genre. Sound is a massive contributor to our ability to interpret the video game world and identify possible threats or opportunities. Our ears, in comparison to our eyes, which are reliant on light and restricted to one direction, are able to create an accurate picture of our entire surroundings, even in the dark. They allow us to pick up the location, size estimation, and possible source of any given sound. For the sake of simplicity, I will define stealth games as a predator versus prey interaction, with the player taking up either or even both roles depending on the situation. Since this kind of interaction requires both the player and the NPCs to be aware of one another, this leads us to the question, how do NPCs actually hear? AI programmers are responsible for creating an AI sensory system which lets NPCs react to certain stimuli in the game world. Each studio approaches the design of their own sensory system slightly differently to meet the needs of their game. But when comparing two very contrasting stealth games like the slow-paced Hitman to the fast and chaotic Dishonored, we can see that the systems are fundamentally very similar. The way they work is as follows. Sound and hearing are both given a spherical radius. The NPC then checks for sounds in its radius, and if there are any, it can be told to go and check them out. The radius for each sound needs to be tuned by the designers to create a fun and fair experience. For example, if I kill this NPC with a bow, I expect no other enemies to be alerted. However, if I shoot him with a gun, I'm anticipating enemies in the area to look for me. In indoor settings with many rooms, it gets slightly more complex because of how the sound propagates. To solve these issues, games often tend to use the 3D pathfinding system to calculate the spread of noise. So in order for sound to move from room A to room B in a realistic way, sound designers use so-called portals, which allow sound to spread naturally from one room to another through an opening like a door or a window. We can now build on this system to add even more depth by having so-called sense modifiers. They change the perception of the NPCs by altering their perception values. Two general modifiers can usually be found in stealth games, the first being the noise floor. This is the combined loudness of all sound sources surrounding the NPC. If it is high enough, meaning the NPC is near a very loud sound emitter like heavy machinery, they will only perceive the player's movement sounds at a very close distance. This can easily be demonstrated. Try to listen carefully to the footsteps as the ambient noise gets louder. The higher the noise floor, the harder it is to hear the softer sounds. The second sense modifier is the alertness status. As I mentioned in my Last of Us 2 video, NPCs' behaviors are often based on finite state machines, which determine what state they are in and what actions they take. Mark Brown explains this nicely in his School of Stealth series.
AI characters exist in a specific state, with relevant actions and animations available to them. When a suitable condition is met, the character will shift into a different state.
What this means for our AI sensory system, in Tom Leonard's words, is that the alertness state of an AI is fed back into the sensor system in various ways to alter the behavior of the entire system. So in a nutshell, when the NPC state changes from idle to alert, his perception radius is increased, meaning he will be more easily aware of the player's sounds. As I mentioned before, these modifiers can also be used by the designers to tune and adjust the difficulty of the game. The definition for the term stealth is a double-edged sword for the player. as on the one side it gives them information about the location of the enemy by listening to their footsteps, but on the other it also reveals theirs. To give the player an advantage, most games have some kind of sneak system, which is either triggered by a button, moving into certain covers like bushes or large crowds, or simply by having it as default. This sneak system lets the player evade the enemy by making their movement sounds virtually silent. The system, however, usually doesn't just turn the volume down, but instead switches to a second set of gentler movement sounds. Thief makes creative use of this system by letting the player shoot moss arrows to change the surface of the environment, muffling their footsteps. When the player does eventually get spotted, it's important to warn them ahead of time, which leads us to the next section about detection. To solve this issue, a lot of games have detection meters. They help indicate what alertness state the enemy is currently in and warn us about imminent detection. The visual indicators can be quite intrusive at times, especially when the NPC behind the player detects them. This is where sound plays a massive role, by giving the player a variety of clear audio cues that rise in intensity, correlating with the alertness level of the NPC. This sounds something like this. Some games like The Last of Us 2 have completely gotten rid of the visual indicator and solely rely on the sound to indicate the state of the NPCs to the player. Once detected, the enemies will call out the location of the player to inform their group. If you're interested in learning more about this, then you can check out my other video on the combat dialogue system of The Last of Us Part 2. Most stealth games allow the player to use some form of X-ray vision in order to make it easier to plan and execute a strategy. This mechanic often works in tandem with the sound, like for example in The Last of Us, where the player can only see enemies through nearby walls if they are making noise. Additionally, a lot of games change the mix in real time by filtering out frequencies or altering the volume of certain sounds. Games like Splinter Cell and Breath of the Wild offer the player a visual display on the HUD, indicating how much noise they are making at any given moment. Since NPCs are attracted to sound, most stealth games feature mechanics which let the player use this to their advantage by creating a distraction. Whether by crafting explosives, throwing bottles, or setting off a car alarm, there are numerous ways the player can utilize sound to draw the NPCs to a certain location, and then either avoid them or take them out. This system usually hooks into the NPC's sensory system and works by assigning the loudness values to objects that attract the NPCs in reach. Our last audio pillar is intel. Games like Hitman and Payday heavily revolve around gathering information to create a solid plan and execute on it. One way players can do this is by listening to NPCs' conversations.
Oh, did you bring the P-41 we left for you in the apartment?
So, someone is here for a tour of the facility. Might be a way to get in.
Developers often create smart systems which trigger these informative dialogues between NPCs when the player is close enough to hear them. This way, the player doesn't miss out on important information. Conversations often happen behind closed doors, and in a real-life scenario, the player wouldn't be able to understand what the NPCs are saying. So the sound designers tune the fall-off curve, which is how far the sound travels outward from the source, as well as the filtering, so the player can still hear it. Some games, such as Dishonored, allow the player to peek through the keyhole and actually hear the conversations as if they were in the same room.
She's blind, not deaf. We're here to do your washing.
She's not stupid either.
Have it your way. We're here to take your money, Granny.
As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and were able to learn something. If you did, then please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to not miss any future episodes. And lastly, a massive shout out to our patrons for supporting the channel. If you want to join the club and gain access to a massive sound library and even more videos, then follow the link in the description. Thank you so much and see you next episode.